invitation. It's a privilege. It's a privilege, and also is the first step of a very good cooperation. And we expect a lot from this cooperation.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for the invitation.
Okay, the streaming is started, so I think that we are ready to start our conversation. So, Enrico, so if you want to start.
Very well, Alessia. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being with us. I think it's a very important moment for all of us. The Italy-ASEAN Association. We are having our focused and very interesting webinar on the two main agreements that were signed at the end of last year. The first one, of course, is Rcep, and the other one is the agreement between the European Union and China. I think, if I'm not wrong, November 15th, the Rcep, and December 30th, the agreement between China and the European Union. This is a webinar in which we are here to try to understand better. We always had opportunities to discuss about the geopolitical implications of Rcep and consequences and many important facts at the geopolitical global level. But within the association and in the board of the association, in the discussions with the leading team of the association, Romeo, Orlandi, Mickey Pipan, the two vice presidents, Alessia, Mosca, Secretary General, and the rest of the team, we discussed about the details, the topic, and the many questions to try to have answers on the contents, on the details of first of all, on Rcep, because we heard in the debates around the world in the last 2 months, I have to say, very different approaches to this agreement. Someone saying there's an under-evaluation, others saying it's an over-evaluation. So our key reason of this seminar is to understand and to have the truth, if I may say. It is not always simple to ask the truth, but I'm sure that our fantastic panelists, I would like to thank Mike Plummer, Simon Tai. I would like to thank very much also our good friend Maurice Fermont, coming and representing here the European Union ASEAN Business Association, and it's for us, it's a privilege to start a cooperation with you. So we are here to understand better and to have, at the end of the time that we will dedicate to this seminar, to have a good idea, a balanced idea on the contents on the two agreements. So I stop here immediately because we would like to exploit all the time we have, take opportunity of the speakers, of the guest speakers and the experts we have. There will be, of course, time for questions and try to understand better the contents and the potential implications. I stop here because Alessia Mosca, Secretary General of the Association, will lead the conversation. So Alessia, you have the floor. I mute myself and I listen.
Thank you very much, Enrico. Yes, we start immediately because today it's an important opportunity for us to understand better. And if I may summarize, which is the question we will try to answer during our conversation, thanks to the distinguished guests that accepted our invitation this morning, is about Rcep, especially Rcep. Is this a real game changer of the international trade relations, or it's just reflecting what was already the reality. So I translated a little bit the initial question from our president, and I leave immediately the floor to our guest, starting with Professor Plummer, who is a professor in international economics at SAIS in Bologna, and I'll ask him to give us a first overview, a general overview, but giving us also the details of what is included in this so important, at least in terms of numbers, for this important agreement. And then we will go on with the other guests that I will introduce to you later, also connecting this agreement, this ASEAN agreement, with the other agreement between the European Union and China on investment. Professor Mike Plummer, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks very much, Alessia, and good morning, everyone. Is it okay if I use a PowerPoint to share? If someone could.
Yes, of course, we will allow you.
Okay, I'm trying to, there we go, excellent. Okay, so yeah, I'm delighted to, first of all, be here and to talk about this, and congratulations to the Italy-ASEAN Association. I think that unfortunately in Europe, when we think about Asia, it's, we think always about China. We don't think enough about us.
Professor Plummer, we are having, sorry, Professor, we are having problem. Okay. Now, no, we can't see. We just saw the presentation for 1 second, and then, okay, now it's okay.
Is it there?
Okay, great. Good. Yes.
Good. Anyway, well, let me just get started then, and to talk a bit, give an overview of the economics of this mega regionalism, with a bit of a focus on ASEAN and Europe. You know, for those of you that aren't familiar with this process of mega regionalism, really the modern trend was sort of started with the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations in 2008, and APEC in 2010 said, well, what we really want to do is to have a region-wide free trade area of the Asia Pacific, and we'll have different tracks to get there. And one track will be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which had already started negotiation. And then there would be another track, which would be an Asian-only track, which eventually became Rcep. And the idea would be is eventually, according to APEC, and very strongly supported by by ABAC, the ASEAN Business Advisory Group, that eventually they would come together, and then there would be a region-wide free trade area. So really, this is part of a process. It was supposed to be done by 2020. Obviously, that's not the case, but this has been something that was aspirational, if you will, from the APEC point of view. The TPP was signed in February 2016 as this first Asia-Pacific mega regionalism. But as everyone knows, I believe the US pulled out of the TPP during Donald Trump's first full day in office. And so a lot of people thought the TPP wasn't going to move forward, but in fact, it reformed as essentially the same agreement without the United States in the form of the very difficult to pronounce Cptpp, the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement on Trade, Trans-Pacific Partnership, which went into effect at the end of 2018. So, and so we've got this, our CPTPPs going forward, and there are a lot of other countries that have said that they were interested in possibly joining the TPP along its path. Now, of course, not all countries have, even the original members have ratified it, including Malaysia, but a number of countries have expressed interest in joining. China is, Premier Li Keqiang in May of last year expressed an interest in joining the CPTPP. This was emphasized by President Xi at his APEC talk in December of last year. over the last 2 weeks, I believe it's been translated into Chinese. So that could be something on the horizon. In January, both South Korea and, well, over the last month, both South Korea and the United Kingdom have expressed interest in possibly joining the Cptpp. So this is an open agreement that will likely expand over time. Now, Rcep is that other side, that other track, if you will, on that from that what was called the Yokohama Vision, and it has all 10 ASEAN countries plus the countries with which ASEAN has a free trade area: China, South Korea, Japan, India, Australia, New Zealand were the members when it was launched in 2012, but India dropped out in November 2019. And as was mentioned earlier, Rcep was signed in November of 2020. And I think it's important to reiterate that Rcep was always supposed to be an ASEAN-centric agreement. If you read the statement when it was launched in November of 2012, it is an ASEAN-centric agreement. To be a negotiating member, original negotiating member, you had to have a free trade area in place for ASEAN. So obviously ASEAN plays a big role in this. And I think that's important to keep in mind, because unfortunately in the Western press, it's always about China, but it's not all just about China. Okay. Now, just very briefly to give a comparison between the Cptpp and the Rcep templates. The Cptpp is far more comprehensive in scope and far more ambitious. And this is something the United States worked on for a number of years, and it was very carefully negotiated. And it really focuses a lot on the comparative advantage of advanced countries, frankly. Services is very big, investment, intellectual property. It also includes things like, on labor, a very strong labor chapter, and something on the environment. Whereas Rcep is it's less ambitious, even though it's supposed to be ambitious, and is focused more on comparative advantage of developing countries. So the Rcep agreement has 20 chapters. It cuts tariffs on 92% of goods compared to 96% in the Cptpp. Most importantly, in my view anyway, it includes a cumulative rules of origin. And Alessia, I think that would be part of my answer to the question would be, sure, it's not as comprehensive, and sure, there were a lot of free trade areas in place when the agreement was signed, but you didn't have cumulative rules of origin, which inhibited supply chains in the region. I think that is where you'll see a big effect. And another area where you'll see a big effect is in Northeast Asia, because the one area where you did not have a free trade area in place was between China, Japan, and South Korea. They had some rounds to discuss free trade area, to create a free trade area. There was a superficial arrangement in place between South Korea and China, but the Rcep agreement is very important, and that's going to be something that I'll talk about in a minute. It does include some NTB liberalization. I'd argue it's a mixed bag on services. You've got positive and negative lists. You've got a lot of flexibility in the arrangement for the low-income economies in Rcep. Obviously, there are no chapters on state-owned enterprises, labor, the environment, which makes it very different than the Cptpp. And there's a lot of other areas that are more WTO and WTO plus, like in intellectual property protection and these things. Okay. So just to look at some numbers on this. Well, first, I think it'd be useful to look at ASEAN's trade patterns over time. And if you look at between 2001 and 2019, you see interregional trade within ASEAN has stayed pretty constant, despite very dynamic sectors. But you see the share of China, which has grown substantially this century. The EU, it's fallen in terms of trade anyway. We're not talking about investment. Japan falling and the US falling, and the rest of the world being important, but a lot of the rest of the world are other Asian economies. And so what you've been seeing for ASEAN is a much greater orientation towards the Asia-Pacific region. I think that trade is going to continue, and Rcep is going to facilitate that. Now, we've done a lot of modeling of this to sort of estimate the effects, and if you want to just look at some numbers, we did this estimates of the effects of this mega regionalism, my co-author Peter Petri and I, in the context of the US-China trade war, because, the trade war is on us. We had our phase 1 agreement in January. And then what we did in our modeling is we estimated the effects of that trade war and then started to add these arrangements, the Cptpp and the Rcep agreement. And we calculated that the US-China trade war would reduce global incomes by $301 billion annually. So that is a very large effect, frankly, by 2030. And the biggest losers, obviously, are especially China, but also the United States due to this trade war. Okay, so that has a big effect on global incomes. The effects on Europe are small, but negative, a negative 13 billion. For the $18 trillion economy, that's not such a big deal, but it is a negative effect. When you add the Cptpp onto this arrangement, you get gains of 121 billion, which slightly offsets the trade war for the global economy, if you will, but completely for Europe. So in other words, with the Cptpp in place, the trade war and the Cptpp are a wash, okay? So Europe is in the same position. And if we add Rcep to this, this adds $209 billion to global income, which offsets the trade war, even though China and the US still lose. So what you end up seeing is after you've got the Rcep in place, you've got a situation in which global income is pretty much compensated for the trade war, but with the problem of the distribution is different. And certainly this leads to a greater reorientation in Asia. If I can just jump ahead, if you look at this in, visually, you've got this trade war in orange here. That's this drop of 301. You had 121 billion for the Cptpp. The Rcep essentially brings you where you were before. But if you add China the Cptpp, as is being discussed, you have a very large increase of $485 billion, mainly due to China's accepting a much more advanced template. And if you add 5 additional economies that are interested in joining, like South Korea and Thailand, Indonesia, et cetera, you get very, very large numbers here. And so the way of, it's perhaps not the smartest thing to do is just stop with the Cptpp and Rcep, because these arrangements are going to be expanding. And if you look at the effects on trade, usually tax effects are 3 times what they are in terms of income. So the trade war reduces global trade by $1 trillion annually. China's loss is half of that, and the US trade also falls. But especially you see these very large increases in trade in Northeast Asia between China, Japan, and Korea. And so if you look at this table, all the green slots, this is the effects of Rcep on trade. You see the increases from Rcep, and the biggest changes by far are South Korean and Japanese exports to China, $178 billion, and Chinese exports to Japan and Korea, which would be $96 billion. You add those together, you get about $250 billion in an arrangement that leads to an increase in trade of $500 billion. So half that change, half those benefits of Rcep are going to be in Northeast Asia. So just to conclude with some implications for Europe and Italy, as I think everybody in this group knows, the gravity of the world economy has been moving towards Asia over the past 3 decades. The Rcep and the Cptpp, as well as expansions, will continue to deepen cooperation and will deepen integration within, particularly in Asia, but also in the Asia-Pacific region. From Rcep anyway, China, Japan, and Korea will see the biggest effects. And this is going to lead to greater competition with Europe and the US. In our numbers, we see that the biggest trade effects of this agreement at a sectoral level are in advanced manufacturers. And so what Rcep is going to do, it's going to facilitate supply chains, et cetera, and it's going to bring the Northeast Asian economies together in a way that creates a lot deeper links And these are going to create, it's going to create a formidable infrastructure, formidable group for competition against the Americans and against Europeans. And these effects will be accentuated if China joins the CPTPP. Now, also China has taken initiative on the Belt and Road Initiative, which we've talked about a lot. And this is the infrastructure that will facilitate integration. And so that's happening simultaneously. And so if you step back and you look what's going, and I'm sure my colleagues will give more insight into this, is that the US 5 years ago really was leading Asia-Pacific integration and was an extremely influential factor in doing it. 5 years hence, and we see that the US has clearly been supplanted by China in this. And you've got China at the vanguard of these policy initiatives, but also with the BRI at a infrastructural level. There's also the question, this is significant for Europe and for the United States, is who's going to be making the rules going forward? And this is important. On the sidelines of big meetings, this is where project takes place. Europe and the United States are going to be on the sidelines, and that could be a problem unless something changes. And so, we would conclude that, Italy, the EU, and the US would do better to engage proactively with the region, including with China, which is actually something that Asian economies would prefer. Perhaps Professor Tay can talk a bit about that. And I would argue, just to conclude, that the CAI might not have large economic effects. I've seen a lot of people who really are not sure about the value added, and we could talk about that. There's some transparency, et cetera, but parts of it seem to be relatively superficial. But it is important superficially. So I think the EU's continuing engagement with the region, I think that's an important thing to do, even though it's just one step. So let me just stop there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was extremely interesting, Professor Plummer. If I can summarize, you start answering our question. The Rcep is starting. It's a game changer in some ways, because there are elements that can be considered really a change in economic relation, and there are bad news, but also good news, or at least a push for Europe and Italy to engage more. And so we are pleased that our association is trying to do exactly this job, to advocate for this focus on the region. So now I give the floor to Professor Tai, who's a friend of the association, and he's associate professor at the National University of Singapore and the chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs. I asked him to give us the perspective from the ASEAN region on the Rcep, on the agreement on investment with China, but also on other perspective of international trade relation between Europe and the ASEAN region. Thank you very much, Professor Tai.
Thank you, Alessia. Thank you all for inviting me. Good evening from Singapore. I understand about 7 to 8 minutes, and I'm addressing mainly a business corporate audience rather than government advisors. I'm very grateful that Michael Plummer has spoken before me, because many, if not all, the points he has said, I completely adopt happily, and I will leave out of my text. Alessia's asked a very sharp question from the start. Is Rcep a game changer, or more or less the status quo rewritten? It's a good question, but in a way, it's the wrong question. A lot depends on your time frame. If you look back over 2 years, I would say it's a significant difference. But if you look back over 20 years, and as Michael Plummer has said, you see it as one of the capstones of various moving parts. I think it is a real game changer. That over the last 20 years, since the WTO started faltering and frankly is failing, Asia is going its own way. Moreover, as we're going through the pandemic, and before that, the global financial crisis, I think Mike Plummer is also correct that without sounding hubris, the center of growth, the highest growth rates are very much in our region. And so any act to connect up the still growing economy of China with the still decent economies of ASEAN, let alone Japan, South Korea, and the others, is significant, both immediately and for the prospective future. So I really think that Rcep will be looked back upon as really one of those milestones that we didn't fully recognize at the time, but is indeed a substantial game changer for the long run up to now and for the next X years. Michael Plummer is also correct that the vast majority of the benefits are with the Northeast Asians. But why? It's not because ASEAN is weak. ASEAN, again, as Michael Plummer said, has led the negotiations quite deliberately. Not the most powerful, but by diplomacy and broad objectives, has steered the Rcep to a conclusion. But the benefits are biggest in Northeast Asia because they had the most problems. Because ASEAN has had the ASEAN Economic Community, a lot of those benefits have come about with our own sub-regional or ASEAN-wide efforts to reduce tariffs, to modify our rules of origin. And where ASEAN has really helped the others is that our imprint, for example, the rules of origin, are down to the ASEAN rules, simplified, low level, so that we can have much better integration. To give you one personal example of this, I helped negotiate Singapore's EPA, Economic Partnership Agreement with Japan, back in 2000, 20 years ago. At that time, the rules of origin was so tight that basically nothing beyond Singapore could somehow qualify. Very, very hard, and deliberately so. So they get the Japanese, as one of the most, frankly, closed economies still, to agree to much broader, lower level ROO has been critical. The effect of this will be transformative. Michael Plummer is correct. There are deep interdependencies in Northeast Asia. But the part I would add, those supply chains also link up increasingly to Southeast Asia. Each country is doing on its own, but now we will see more complete and more complex supply chains that will use Japan to China, China to parts of ASEAN. So don't look for ASEAN itself, but look for the weave between the more developed economies, the more manufacturing-based economies of Korea, Japan, and China, not to put China last, of course, and ASEAN. Especially, of course, the first place to see this is in Vietnam, where Alessia and I first met. Vietnam is the crucible that sees that overflow and quite clearly is trying to drive its own change using various FTA agreements, including with the EU. So I think the lowering the tariffs, yes, that's done. Standardizing custom rules and procedures, widening market access. I agree, Michael Plummer, not to the best degree. But here I'd add another point. Please remember that politically, we had to include every single ASEAN member. And we were trying to include India. Now, of course, we can delve into that failure later. But remember that basically we were trying to create not only a Northeast Asian FTA, we were trying to create the first bilateral FTA between India and China. It's a failure, but a kind of historic, heroic failure. And it might still happen at some point in the future. We've left the door open for India, but we've also decided to move ahead. Alessia asked me to be more specific. I'm not sure I can be beyond what Mr. Plummer has said. But one example is that for Rcep, China will commit to eliminate tariffs on 86% of Japan's exports, including auto parts. And this really, I think, is quite significant to any concession one could imagine China giving Japan bilaterally or even trilaterally. So these are things that I think we can bank home and look for new dynamics in the region. I must admit there's some carve-outs which will be understandable, but should be noted. The lack of environment and labor standards. I think we will move on this, at least in terms of carbon. Not necessarily in agreement, but because in this same year, China, Japan, and Korea have separately undertaken net zero carbon targets. They must drive this through their supply chains with each other and through the region. And I think this will be another effort to create a kind of climate community and linkages through the supply chains. The other carve-out is, of course, in agriculture. There are some modest effects of tariff reductions, but really, like global games, agriculture has tended to be rather a closeted national sort of pet that can't be, completely subordinated. Let me move on to my last point, and this is about how I think European businesses can benefit from Rcep. Rcep, of course, has to be seen as not the only game, as I said, but several different games, and one of them is the EU-ASEAN FTA, which is being sort of discussed bilaterally but not fully negotiated. There will be many obstacles. Singapore already has a bilateral FTA, and so does Vietnam. But we are in favor of a broader regional. This will help really link ASEAN back up with another key player to avoid the either-or games, which Michael Plummer suggested might come up. That basically is either Asia rises or Europe rises. We might end up being a sort of zero-sum competitors. I hope I'm not over-reading Dr. Plummer. But I think that this can be avoided if we go back to the idea of interregional and don't give up on the WTO, even though it's been really dark years in the last few years. For my country, we certainly want to be part of ASEAN and Asia, but we are not at all adverse to others taking part. So this idea of open regionalism, and we want ourselves to engage as many partners in manufacturing, trade, and economic growth as possible. And so one of the key parts to understand for businesses is that this Rcep opens up the ability for Italian businesses, European business, to just simply base yourself in one place, especially Singapore, of course, I should say that, right? And then to run your value chains and operations right across the region, and much more harmonized compared to even before Rcep, but certainly much more easily than it was 5, 10, let alone 20 years ago. The EU remains a very important partner for ASEAN. For ASEAN compared to Northeast Asia, we are not in direct competition. There are a lot of complementarities. So the EU-ASEAN FTA does make a lot of sense. You're already the largest investor in the ASEAN countries with some $40 billion. I think that ASEAN investment on the opposite side may not be too surprising, not as high, but certainly not too small. The last figure I got in 2017 was 140 billion euro from ASEAN into Europe. So I think there are a lot of areas where we can and should move forward together. Let me stop there and let respond to questions or comments. Maybe one last point. I want to reiterate Michael Plummer's point that it is not China-led, but certainly I can't fool anybody that China is not a major part of the equation. With the expected growth rates coming out of China, we are already seeing the uplift of logistics and business supply chain with China being the dynamic change that will probably lift ASEAN out of the present slump it's in.
Thank you very much, Simon. It was really very interesting, especially one point that give me the opportunity to introduce our following guest. You mentioned for business the importance of predictability of rules and the fact that there's an harmonized system. And I think this is one of the most important elements the businesses are asking, and one of the elements that is at the core of this new set of rules in Asia. So as said, this gives me the opportunity to introduce Mr. Fermont, and I really thank him also for being with us this morning, because he can give us the voice of business, the reaction of business, of European business to all of these new agreements. He's an advisor for Business Europe, and so he can really give us this perspective, which is also very important to understand better this agreement. The floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Alessia, and good morning and good evening to everyone. Let me just start by saying that I actually agree with a lot of what Professor Plummer and Professor Tay have said, and I'm glad that you've covered the ground that you've covered. What I will try and do is maybe to just highlight 3 very short points on Rcep, and then focus most of my few minutes on the comprehensive agreement on investment between the EU and China, to add a bit of flavor there, and what it means for us, and what we think it is, and what it isn't, of course. So to start with Rcep and the way we see it, it's definitely an important agreement. It includes a lot of countries, and we've just seen the figures. As Professor Plummer said, there are some limitations to the level of ambition that this agreement has. So for us, looking at this, our agreement between the EU and, for instance, Japan is a lot more far-reaching than Rcep in terms of not just liberalization, but also the other types of provisions in new areas of trade policy. But nevertheless, we do anticipate some trade diversion effects, like Professor Plummer also outlined, which basically means that there is going to be an increasing regionalization, also in part due to the streamlining and simplification of rules of origin that Professor Tay highlighted as well. And so what does this mean? Obviously, you've given the first point, that for European businesses present in the region, it's going to be easier to operate across the different markets. But nevertheless, for business that is sort of competing through exports to the region, this definitely has a different meaning. And I can only subscribe to the call that we need an EU-ASEAN free trade agreement. This is something that Business Europe is in favor of. We already have a number of bilateral agreements in the region with Vietnam, with Japan, Korea, Singapore. A few others are under negotiation. So for us, this is really a wake-up call, in a sense, to press ahead with what is ongoing, and to conclude what is still on the table, to offset those diversion effects. And we're well aware that a lot of the global growth is going to take place outside of Europe in the next few years, and that's also why traditionally, if you look at the EU and Europe's trade policy, it's very ambitious. It has the largest free trade network. It's the largest trading entity in the world. And so we're happy to have that as a backdrop to be moving from, especially if compared to the US, where you see the tendency perhaps for greater protectionism, or at least less of an appetite to join new agreements. That, as far as Rcep is concerned, maybe just a few points on the investment agreement with China and what we think of it. So, for the purpose of comparison, and I agree with Professor Plummer there, this is not a traditional free trade agreement, and obviously it's not going to deliver the kind of trade volumes or trade liberalization that traditional trade agreements deliver. It is an investment agreement with a couple of additional elements, and there's 3 points to it that really stand out. It has a market access component, it has a so-called level playing field component, and it has a sustainable development component. And I'll just briefly touch on all 3 and what they mean for us. In terms of market access, we see first a sort of binding of China's current level of openness, meaning that this creates legal certainty for European companies, that China cannot reduce openness in certain sectors, which it currently extends already to its trading partners. But beyond that, there is really a selective opening in a few sectors, in manufacturing and in services, for European businesses. Manufacturing covers about 50% of FDI coming from Europe into China. And one element there, for instance, is the removal of joint venture requirements for instance, the automotive sector. In the area of services, I'll just touch on a couple. We see some commitments to liberalize China's financial services sector, to remove joint venture requirement in the area of private hospitals, for example, in top-tier cities, the removal of investment bans in the area of cloud services, in maritime transport, but also the removal of restrictions in business services like management consulting, like advertising, and so on. And lastly, there also the removal of joint venture requirements in environmental services, and removal of restrictions for construction services. So those are some of the targeted openings that we see through this agreement. The other important pillar, the second part, is to do with level playing field. And there are four key elements to it. One is that there are provisions in this agreement to discipline the behavior of state-owned enterprises, which is a big ask. And for the EU, this means that state-owned enterprises should act on commercial considerations and should not discriminate in how they procure or purchase sales of goods and services. The other part is, of course, forced technology transfer, a long-standing request from European business that prohibits the types of investment requirements that actually lead to this involuntary transfer of technology, as well as prohibitions in other performance requirements that are not considered to be fair. In the area of subsidies, it's limited, committing to further transparency in how China subsidizes in the area of services. But this will be useful for another element that I'll touch on when I close. And lastly, for the playing field, we see that European companies will, for the first time, have access to China's standard-setting bodies. And this is important, particularly as standards are going to be increasingly important when it comes to international trade. China has the ambition of becoming a global leader in standard setting. So the fact that European businesses are able to contribute to that, to stimulate as far as possible international standards, that is a big plus. The third and final part has to do with sustainable development, and there are two key parts there that are important, also for Europe's sort of political commentators, to put it that way, and those are provisions on the environment and provisions on labor. With regard to environment, it was already mentioned by Professor Tay. China already has signified that it wants to become carbon neutral by 2060. China is a signatory of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so in that sense, that is not a very contentious part of the agreement. But on labor, we know that China has not ratified all ILO conventions. And for Europe, this is an important part, that China effectively bans forced labor. And in the investment agreement, there is a commitment that China will work towards the ratification of that ILO convention. But as you might have seen in the media, a lot of the discussion in Europe is now about to what extent that is actually going to result in China making up on that commitment. So what is in it for us? Two or three very brief points before I'll wrap up. We as Business Europe have been pushing for this agreement for quite a while. It's, we believe, a key component in the broader European strategy for rebalancing its relationship with China. Across the Atlantic, there was some immediate criticism when Europe reached a political conclusion on this deal. But as I said at the beginning, it is a limited agreement. It is not a full-fledged free trade agreement. And so it's important to bear in mind what it is and what it isn't when evaluating this agreement. For us, besides market access, the real commitments on level playing field are very important, because this is the first time China has made these commitments, and these are key in addressing the market distortions that we face, both in China but also on the European market. And although our wish list is not empty now, our initial view is that this is an improvement on the status quo. It's limited, and of course time will tell how it will play out. But much of it also relates to the enforcement of the agreement. So whatever it says on paper is one thing, of course. How it is then enforced and followed up on is crucial. And on that, we're glad to see that there is some political commitment as well, that there is follow-up at vice premier level and at executive vice president level of the European Commission to ensure that that this agreement will receive the proper scrutiny that it deserves. But in conclusion, I'd like to say that there's just one step in a broader strategy the EU has with regard to China that aims to rebalance that. The EU and China are already each other's top trading partners when it comes to trading goods. So beyond just enlarging trade, it is also about ensuring that that trade is fairer, and transparency in subsidies in China, for instance, will help Europe in tackling distortive effects on its home market with regard to those subsidies, as just one example. I'll stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, if I may say, from your intervention, we can say that the European Union started to answer this wake-up call with something that is not enough, but at least is doing something also with this agreement on investment after the other agreement, the FTA, that in the region was negotiated and concluded in the last year, starting from Japan, South Korea, and Singapore and Vietnam. So the European Union is engaging, and we really need that this engagement will go farther. It's strange, if I may comment, it's strange that in the trade review communication that was released last week, the relations with the region, with ASEAN and in the Indo-Pacific region in general, occupy such a tiny part. So I just mentioned one, which does not reflect what in reality the European Union is doing. So that's a point that we could develop, and perhaps we should push a little bit more the institution to make also a stronger point on its strategy on the region. Now I wanted to give the floor to Romeo Orlandi, our Vice President of the Association, for the conclusive intervention, and I will ask him to make a general conclusion on all the points that have been made by our guests, and especially for his expertise, his extensive expertise on China. What we would like to develop is the role that has already been mentioned by the other guests, but it's important from our point of view to see which is the role that China has played and is playing in all these relations, and especially on this last agreement that we just covered with Maurice. Thank you very much, Romeo.
Alessia, thank you everybody the conventional wisdom says that there was an acceleration for the signature of the agreement with China due to the role of Germany as a president of the 2020 European Commission. Also, many analysts believe that the policy President Trump towards Asia and towards the rest of the world brought to a kind of isolationism, protectionism for the US. So China was ready to enter the space and sign the RCEP with the other Asian countries. But what was the Chinese point of view? What main decision that brought China to finally put the signature on those two important issues we are discussing about? Of course, the answer is complex. Probably the one is that China, having won the battle against underdeveloped, now is ready to cash in the political dividends of its success. With the new foreign policy, able to engage Beijing not only as a challenge for other calls, but also for being ready to do it. So the message from Beijing seems to be not only we would like to be engaged, but we are the main actor in this engagement, and we are trying to have the political dividends on it with the new foreign policy. The winning back for China is that after 40 years from the new policy started from paramount leader Deng Xiaoping, China has achieved so huge, big, and meaningful results that now is ready to negotiate on the same level with all the countries in the world. There is no political economic issue in the international agenda for which China can be neglected. This was due to a progressive success that China experienced. The economists call it 10% growth of GDP every single year. No other country in the world experienced the same success. But now that China, having reached the goal it wanted to achieve, is ready to kind of negate the same policy China did. China now is, of course, different, but the China we used to know, eager to enter the international arena at any cost. That's the interpretation of China signing the access to WTO in 2001 is an interpretation in Western circles that China putting a signature on the CAI or exactly the truth for China. I mean, China is paying some cost to enter this negotiation, to sign those negotiations. And just now that President Xi Jinping is strong enough after having defeated the internal oppositions to those entering the arena, because now China is enough to do it, also strong enough to pay the consequences or to face the consequences of this negotiation in terms of transparency, even to foreign companies, to the elimination of privileges of state-owned enterprises, or abolishing the compulsory formation of joint venture for specific sectors. So China is conceding, at least on paper, and on the other side, and specifically with, at least on paper, not much less to receive, because paradoxically, Europe was already open to China, or at least much more than China was already open Europe. So Europe was more on the convening side rather than China. So why China decides to give up? Because it is ready. It is ready to do it. It is ready to launch an offensive on foreign policy like it never did before. Former leader, said to his comrades, be shy, be bashful, concentrate your activity in defeating the underdevelopment. Forget the animosity of the World War II. Collaborate with countries like South Korea or Japan, which formerly belonged to the other side of the so-called Cold War. But now that bet, that bashful position is over. That China free of the world, that China able to receive investment, inject technology from every part of the world because they were welcome in China, progressively given to history. China has been the spouse of a bizarre marriage for interest with multinationals. There was a win-win situation for multinationals in China, which progressively defeated the backwardness due to the help of those multinationals. The China factory of the world, the China manufacturing consumer goods for every China associated with cheap labor cost, China associated with discipline, is progressively consigned to history, leaving the stage to a modern and more powerful China. Now, if you want to invest in, let's say, cheap labor products, the suggestion from China, go somewhere else, because already China is going somewhere else. So, particularly the one with Europe, it is not leading to an increase in investment on labor goods in China, but it's leading to quality, it's leading to new sectors, it's leading to sharing technology. As I is willing to share technology because it's powerful and ready enough to do it, because the China we used to know is no longer there. So what might be the conclusion of this? That probably trade will progressively leave the floor to investment. Yes, still China is a huge market, but we shouldn't go ahead with set of a market that's so big as 1.4 citizens, not actually consumers, or at least not yet. What is important, a message from China is that not only bring your money here, bring your investment here, we can protect your money, and then you can do whatever you want in our country. But the message is more clear. The global value chain, China is the main or one of the main. We can create value together. Try to respect the rules, of which of course are a big part. Then the rest, it's up to negotiation. Different level of strength. And in my personal opinion, negotiation is the only way we can do things with China. Specifically for Europe, but also for other countries in Asia, I take the liberty to say that everybody should negotiate. And those two signatures, those two agreements go to the right direction. Now, no other place rather than negotiation to solve the international tensions. We are already on the rise in Asia due to also to the new foreign policy of China. Of course, I conclude here, and I'm ready to.
Very final comments. I don't know, probably you have a bad connection.
Okay. My final remark is that negotiation is the only way we have to face, and we push agreements. They go to the right direction. You hear me, Alessia? You hear me, Mike? Yeah.
Okay.
The floor to Alessia. Okay.
Yes, sorry, but we lost you in your very final remarks. I don't know if it was a problem from it's my problem or your connection, but in any case, perhaps you can just conclude, perhaps rephrase the last comments.
I'll try to do it again. My final remarks were those two agreements. They open the floor and the space for a more intense negotiation, which, in my personal opinion, is the only way to pursue dealing with China. I see your image looks frozen on the screen.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Romeo. The last part of your intervention, I think that we had a very rich conversation and presentation from our guests. I want to thank again all of you. It was really extremely rich, extremely interesting. So I would like to give the to someone that wants to intervene or raise some questions.
I think we've lost Alessia.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you
Can't see you, but we can hear you, I think.
Even hearing you is intermittent, yeah?
Alessia, should I answer a question that's in the chat section?
Yes, please, Professor Plummer. Go ahead. I see the question is for you.
Okay, the question is, as everyone could see in the chat, is about whether the U.S. Should rejoin the Cptpp and what are some of the challenges in doing so. And, I should mention that we spent a lot of time modeling the U.S. in the TPP, and actually the United States would have gained the most from that agreement. And I remember giving our results at one of the negotiating rounds and in various countries. And interestingly, in places like Malaysia, et cetera, it was, well, this is all great for the United States, but what about us? I mean, why should we sign this? So when Donald Trump ripped up the agreement saying it was a terrible agreement for the United States, let's just say that we were disappointed, because actually it was quite a good agreement for the United States. And I continue to believe that the United States should try to join the Cptpp, both from an economic as well as from a strategic perspective. And when the Trump administration pulled out of it, actually, I know, Prime Minister Lee of Singapore, Prime Minister Abe of Japan, et cetera, said, look, whatever you think about the economics, if you tear this up, you will be perceived as disengaging from the region, and that's a problem for you. So I think that and it has been a big problem for the United States, and that the US really does need to think about rejoining it. Now, the politics of it would be complicated. The new Biden administration, Joseph Biden was pro TPP when it was tabled. I think many people in his agreement in his new administration would be pro TPP and therefore to rejoin the Cptpp. But politically, at this point in time, it's not a priority. The current administration has a lot of things to deal with, and I don't think personally that we would see the U.S. Trying to rejoin the Cptpp before the midterm elections at the end of next year. And that's unfortunate because who knows what's going to happen with China. Now, I'd be interested in hearing the thoughts of others. I've always taken China for its word. It is just not this past year that China's expressed interest in joining the Cptpp. In the past, it's considered joining the TPP. But I think that if you look at the arrangement, a lot of the things that are the substance of the Cptpp is where China wants to go. And so and frankly, if China does join it, a lot of the issues that the Europeans and the Americans complain about on forced technology transfer and the treatment of investments, on competitive neutrality of state-owned enterprises, and on market access and things, there's a big chunk of it there. So I don't think it's really such a I think we should resist sometimes the grand conflict between the U.S. and China, like in the Cold War days. I think things are very different, and the U.S. should set its sights on joining. But I think that China's joining would also be very positive for the global economy and indirectly, eventually, for the United States. But it is in the U.S. interest to stay engaged.
Thank you, Professor Plummer. I see Alessia is back, but I would like to thank Ms. Silvia Guizzo for the question, Professor Plummer for your reply. And I saw Simon Tai reacted on the chat, but Professor Tai, if you want to comment on it, please, the floor is yours. No, okay.
Go on.
Okay. So Alessia, if you are okay.
Yes, I'm very sorry. I had a technical problem, so I completely lost the connection. I don't know if there are other questions. So if not, I don't know if Enrico is still with us and want to make final comments, or if some of our speaker would like to react to the presentations of the other. Enrico, so if you...
No, yes, I thank you, but also I would like to maybe end up with an engagement that we take here, that is to follow the developments, because I think it was very good and very interesting what we heard, what we learned, but it is clear that the developments will fix the track. And it's not easy today to say what will be the scenario in 2 years' time or in 3 years' time. And the evolutions of the scenario will depend on the way in which the different actors will decide to act. That means the European Union, ASEAN countries, China, and of course, the US. And I think that depends also on the way in which the WTO will play a role, the way in which after the new general director appointment, the WTO and in general, the multilateralism will play a role in the next future. So I think we can maybe decide to continue following all these developments. And thank you so much for our speakers. And thank you, Romeo. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Maurice. And thank you, Simon. And of course, thank you, Alessia. And thank you all. See you soon.